Hello and welcome back to the Gomer's YouTube channel, where, as you know from previous videos, we try and bring you up-to-date information about beer, wine, and spirits, particularly during this holiday season that we are in of Thanksgiving and Christmas. We like to bring you wines that are going to be on our food table as we celebrate with our close family this year, given the all the precautions that everybody is taking, given the COVID and all of that here of 2020. Today I'm joined once again by Rich Zelich. He's the brand manager for Pinnacle Imports here in Kansas City. And one of our favorite varieties of wine is Zinfandel. We both love Zins. I don't know there's a Zin I've met that I really haven't enjoyed. You know.
Well, it's an amazing grape that does a lot of different things. Just before we started recording, we were kind of talking about just the versatility of it. But Pat, I know you really love Zin, and the store has always donated designated a pretty good amount of space for Zin. So, I mean, what are some of the producers you think of when we're talking about great Zinfandel?
When we talk about Zin, I mean, obviously the three that we have here on the table, you know, but Joel Peterson, I mean, just
Founder
a rock star,
Ravenswood.
Morgan Twain Peterson, you know, and there, Chris Cottrell with Bedrock, Paul Draper with Ridge, you know, which this store has always been, to my knowledge, best of my knowledge, the number one Zin. The Ridge Zinfandel account in the entire state of Missouri. So thank you, folks, for continuing to support Ridge here. We love the Ridge. And then you know, Mike Officer
from Carlisle.
From Carlisle.
Yep.
Just really spectacular guys that make just some really great Zins, and all different price points too. Zen is one of those that you don't have to spend 50, 60, 80, or $100 or more a bottle to get some really quality wine to enjoy now and to lay down for several years.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. A lot of times people think of Zinfandel as being this grape that you've got to drink kind of early in the first couple of years when it's all about the fruit, and that can be really true, but there are great examples that really get better with age. A lot of the stuff from Chris Cottrell and Morgan Twain Peterson from Bedrock, I like their wines better after a couple of years. They've got so much structure that they really need a little time to unpack. But one of my first great exposures to how good, really top-notch Zin could age was actually from this very room. Tom Stacy, who used to own Gomer's North, had brought in some great bottles of 15-year-old single vineyard wines from Ravenswood, and I had a chance to try some of those and was just blown away at how fresh they were. You know, Zinfandel's kind of an interesting grape. We tend to think of this as sort of America's grape, but this is not a grape that is American in origin. And it really wasn't that long ago that we figured out where Zinfandel truly came from. For a long time, we thought maybe it was Pavich Mali. It turns out they're related, but it's not the same grape. I think it wasn't until about 20 years ago, in 2001, that a group of researchers went out in search of the origins of this and found in Croatia a grape called Sreljanak, which doesn't have anywhere near enough vowels in it, a lot of consonants together, but Sreljanak, and figured that this is, that's the same grape, and it was from a vineyard that had been planted somewhere between 60 and 80 years before, so this wasn't a new thing where somebody had said, oh, I've had California Zin, I'm going to plant it here. So the following year they went back and they found a grape that was the same grape, but it was being called Pribidrag there. And again, almost too many consonants and not enough vowels. But the thing about Pribidrag is that name is remarkably close to Tribidrag, which is a grape that was mentioned back in the 15th century. It was one of the top wines of the Venetian court. So there was some etymological evidence that these might be the same grape as Zinfandel. For example, in Italy, Zinfandel is known as Primitivo, and that means the first to ripen in Latin. Primi is first, basically. Well, Tribidrag, the Greek translation of that, is early ripening. So there was all this evidence, and now with DNA tracing, we've been able to figure out that, yes, Zinfandel actually hails from Croatia once upon a time, and so now a lot of times researchers will refer to it as Tribidrag by its parent name. I have yet to see Tribidrag have a section in your store.
No, it doesn't.
But that's Zinfandel.
Yeah, and on the Primitivo, that's just a young wine that is so fresh and bright that goes with, oh my gosh, we drank it on the screen-in porch with what's that fancy word for meat and cheese tray?
Charcuterie.
That word. I'm not real fancy, but with meat and cheese, and it's one of those that you can also put a little chill on. So if you're sitting outside and it's on the porch or around the area here around Parkville on the boat, it's one that you can put a chill on, and it just goes fantastic. Just very, very versatile with light food fare. Now these you want a little bit heavier food to go with, but we'll talk about that here in just a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's right. Let's go ahead and dive into wine number one. So we're going to start with Marietta's Old Vine Red, and you talked about the fact that you'll see Zinfandels and all kinds of price points, and this is a great example of kind of the entry level. This is about $14 on the shelf. This is frequently on the sale, but this is a wine that year in and year out I think is one of the best values you can get in red wine. And Marietta was started by a guy named Chris Bilbrough. His son Scott now owns it. Chris sadly passed away a few years ago, but he'd already sold the winery to his son Scott. And Scott has continued with the legacy that his father started. So Chris started Marietta in 1978, and in 1982 he started producing this bottling, which has always just been called Old Vine Red. And what we've got with us today is Old Vine Red Lot number 70. Now, this is not 100% Zinfandel. This is always based on Zinfandel, but then you'll see other things blended in here like Syrah, Petite Syrah, sometimes Barbera, Carignan, Sangiovese. And this essentially replicates the blends that were kind of planted in California. And you used to see all these wines made that were what we called field blends. So it wasn't until after Prohibition where you started to see more monoculture, where you'd see a Cabernet vineyard, a Chardonnay vineyard in California. Prior to that, you'd see, well, here's some Petite Syrah. Over there's a green Hungarian plant. Over there's a Trousseau Gris. Well, here's some Burger. Well, here's some Carignan. It was all just sort of planted together in vineyards. And the people who planted these vineyards, Chinese immigrants, Eastern European immigrants, Italian immigrants, people who had been in America for a while but were moving out west, they just started making these field blend wines from there. So this is kind of reminiscent of those old field blends. So let's see, we're starting all the way to our right, right there with the Old Vine Red. So, we'll demask. We are observing social distancing protocol here. I always love this wine.
Nice nose.
There's a really famous wine critic, I believe she's master of wine, and a wine writer named Jancis Robinson, and she calls this possibly California's best value wine of any color. This is the Old Vine Red.
This is really good. This is really good. You mentioned that Marietta, this is lot 70, and I know we had lot 69, lot 68. What is that? In other wines we have up here, we'll have I can't remember what vintages we're doing on the Biale and the Bedrock, but it'll be 2015, 18, 17.
Right.
Does that mean anything with 70? Is that a vintage?
Why the lot number instead of vintage? I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
No, it's a really good question. This is actually a non-vintage, or maybe more accurately called a multi-vintage blend. And this is interesting. I think it is sometimes easier to sell wines with a vintage. Wine Spectator will have on their cover, this was a great vintage in California. Sure, yeah. Which is kind of silly because California is made up of tons of different microclimates, all kinds of different terroirs in there. So it can be kind of weird to paint that with a big brush. But I think customers tend to gravitate towards this. And that's fine. The problem is a lot of times wineries have to release wines when they're a little young. Cuvée cash flow is what they are sometimes called. But if you don't have to do that, you can get a wine that's a little bit more enjoyable. So this is based on Zinfandel, that is from the 2018 vintage, I believe. I actually made some notes. From 18, and then it has Syrah and Petite Syrah that are blended in from 2016 and 2017. Right. And what that means is those wines have had a little bit of time to kind of unpack, like we were talking about, and soften a little bit. Petite Syrah is a fairly tannic grape varietal. And so you get a wine that actually provides, I think, a lot more complexity and drinkability by being able to blend in those other vintages. I love the freshness of this wine. This is just really silky. It's bright on the nose.
It's got a really, really silky, supple, if that's a word to describe.
Absolutely.
A wine. But it's also got great structure. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot. There's some solid things going on in this.
So one of my real go-tos for barbecue is Zinfandel, and I love this with Zin. This reminds me has almost like this Chinese five-spice thing. Like this with some duck would be really, really cool.
Yes.
But yeah, this is year in and year out. I really do think one of the best value reds that you can get. Obviously, red blends have become a huge thing in the store. There's all kinds of fanciful labels, apothic and things like that. But this is one of the wines that really started that. There's a lot of heritage here.
Yeah, and if folks that are watching and listening, if you do like those red blends that have a lot of Zinfandel, one that Gomer's here in Parkville has really embraced over 10, 11, 12 years is Bogle Phantom, which we do a release of that every October. Hopefully it hits before before Halloween. People kind of like to have parties around it. But
Phantom, nice.
Yes, but it is the last couple of years it has got predominantly more and more and more Zinfandel in that wine than some of the other grapes that have been in there, and I think just really makes that a much better wine for what it is. You know.
Yeah, there is certainly something to be said for adding more Zinfandel because they can give this real suppleness, this brightness of fruit. They can be wonderful blending grapes. It actually happens a lot. In California, there has to be a certain percentage of the wine that is made up by whatever grape varietal you're going to put on the front of the label. So if we're putting Zinfandel on the label, it has to be at least 75% Zinfandel. But as we mentioned, a lot of those great old vines vineyards, they weren't planted that way. It wasn't until the 40s when you started seeing people go, okay, I'm planting a Cabernet vineyard, a Chardonnay vineyard, a Pinot vineyard. Before that, there was all this stuff. Which is kind of a nice segue into the second wine, which is the Bedrock Old Vine Zinfandel. Now this is Zin. This is labeled as Zinfandel. There's enough Zin in here that you can call it that. But this is made from some of the best vineyards for Zinfandel and other varietals in California. And the guy who owns this, you mentioned, is Morgan Twain Peterson. His father, Joel Peterson, was the founder of the Ravenswood Winery. Brilliant, brilliant Zinfandel producer, among other things. Great Petit Syrahs and Merlots and things. But clearly the apple doesn't fall too far from the tree, or the grape doesn't fall too far from the vine. Morgan's a brilliant winemaker. So this is fruit that comes from his own vineyard, which is called the Bedrock Vineyard, that his father Joel purchased. That was planted in 1888. There's fruit here from Pagani Ranch, from Papera, from Isola, from Evangelo Vineyard, from Taldeschi. I mean, these are famous Zinfandel vineyards. And they're famous for being Zinfandel vineyards, but the cool thing is there's a lot of other stuff that's planted in some of these. So Mataro, which is Mourvedre by another name, Grenache, Alicante Boucher, Sangiovese. There's all this cool stuff, Petit Syrah, that's blended in. So this is about 85% Zinfandel, and then the rest is stuff. It's stuff that is planted in these vineyards, most of which they've now identified, but there are still a couple of parcels in a few of the vineyards where they're like, yeah, we don't know what that grape is. They just get referred to as mixed black grapes because they're dark-skinned grapes that we don't know what they are yet.
Man, well, I'll tell you what we do know is that this is outstanding.
Yeah,
this is fantastic.
This always is. Years ago, there was a great somm here, a guy named Jamie Jameson. Hi, Jamie. Who was at the American Restaurant. And when we first picked up this winery, I took the bottle of wine in and I blind tasted him on it. And he described Zinfandel to a T. He talked about the spice and the bramble and the red fruit and all this stuff. And he said, I would have said Zinfandel, but it's not big and overblown the way Zinfandel tends to be now. I was like, pulled off the bag, it's Zinfandel. You're exactly right. But this isn't that crazy high octane, 17%, a wash in American oak. Kind of Zinfandel that was really in vogue for a while that I personally found kind of hard to drink.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. I mean, sometimes some of these Zinfandels in particularly can come right out of the bottle at 14.6%, bordering right there on that 15 that are just they're just too big. There's too much alcohol in the nose that you just don't enjoy them.
Well, we'll be honest, a lot of those things labeled as 14.6 or 15.6
Well,
or
right.
16 or, legally
Right,
you have
legally,
a percentage
right.
point up or down, and then there are people who, they may have forgotten to change their labels from time to time, and they might be a little higher octane.
Right.
No, Zin can produce a lot of sugars, and that's fine. The alcohol by itself isn't an issue as long as everything is in balance. And I don't know if we talk about that word often enough. Balance is so key. Is there balance between the fruit here, the alcohol, the spice, the acidity that makes your mouth water, the tannin that helps give the wine structure, that works on proteins, it works on barbecue and steak and all those things? If everything's in harmony, I don't mind a bottle of wine if it's a little higher in alcohol. As Samuel Adams said, it'll get you drunk. Love Samuel Jackson. Love Samuel Jackson. But if all it is high alcohol, well, that's not so fun. But
No.
I think these wines age really beautifully. There is always incredible balance here. And Chris and Morgan are just getting better and better at their craft. They've done this for, I guess we're probably about a decade in with working with their wines now, which has been a treat. But they just go from strength to strength to strength.
Yep. No, to stay with Bedrock for just a second. Earlier this year, we did one of the first virtual tastings we did. This year was with
Chris.
Bedrock, and we were perusing the shelves and the backstock, and we found an older wine, an older Bedrock, and I can't remember if it was like a 13 or a 14 that had just kind of gotten shuffled. As things do, when you start to rearrange things and things kind of get moved around or they get put in the back and they get in a box that gets pushed. But I found that and I was like, oh, I'm going to get that. And I took that home and it was just outstanding. I mean, it was just phenomenal for, I want to say it was a 14.
That's really cool.
And it was really delicious. A lot of the bigness of it had calmed down quite a bit, and it was just absolutely enjoyable.
I like that word, the bigness. That's awesome, actually. Yeah, wines. It's hard for us as wine consumers, especially in this state, unless we sit on wine for a while, to get to try wines that are older. And wines really do change as they age. And I'd love to say that wine just gets better with age, like Pat and I clearly do. We get better with age.
Wow.
But the truth is,
about that.
the truth is, wine, honestly, like Pat and myself, we change as we get a little bit older.
Yes.
And some people may not like that. You may be all in for Zinfandel's real fresh, vibrant, fruity character. We used to talk here in the tasting room about them being the Labrador Retriever wines, and they just love you right now, and they're so easy to love back.
Yeah.
And that's cool, but there's also something to be said for these wines as they change and mature, and that fruit fades, and we start getting these interesting secondary or tertiary characteristics. So it can be hard to have those experiences. So it's always amazing when you can find a bottle of something that's got a little bit of age on it. So yeah, that's what a neat experience.
Yeah,
that's really cool.
It's really cool. It's really cool when you're able to stumble across those surprises. And I know talking with customers over the last few months, people are drinking more and more and more what's in your home cellar. That you're like, I'm going to save this for another 10 or 15 years. But people are beginning, I think, realize that why wait?
Eat, drink, and be merry, for there may be no morning after.
Yeah, exactly. So they're coming in, and you guys are customers are coming in and saying, oh, I had this wonderful 1995 cab, or this 2002 Zinfandel from here, or this Pinot Noir from 2012. And normally in the United States we drink wine within about 48 hours of taking it home. Yeah, I'm definitely following that camp. But even at home, Ginger and I are pulling stuff out of the basement that where we had tags on it said, let's wait till 10 years, or let's wait till Thomas graduates high school, and we're like, no, let's drink that now and let's enjoy that. And it's such an experience.
Just make sure you replace those wines. You've got to buy new wines so you can age those as well.
That's right.
Speaking of age, I just want to talk very briefly about Old Vines. Old Vines is there's no technical definition. There's no legal term for how old vines are. I'll give a very brief description of why old vines are significant. The first thing is vines as they age start to produce less and less fruit. Pat, if you and I planted a new vineyard out there, obviously there are vineyards outside planted in Norton. If we decided to plant more grapes out there, we'd have to wait about 3 years before the vines were producing really any fruit. And then for a couple of years, they produce more and more fruit, and the fruit gets better and better, and you start making some really good wines. And that happens for a while. The vigor goes up, the productivity goes up, and then it kind of tapers off, and then it starts, or it flattens out, and then it'll start tapering off. And then it'll kind of plateau again. So these older vines don't produce as much fruit, but the fruit that they do produce tends to be really wonderful. The energy for a given vine is going into fewer grapes, and you get better quality grapes in theory. There's also a discussion to be had about root stocks, and some of these great old vines might have been planted before phylloxera started wiping out vines, which happened in California first and then later on in the rest of the world. So sometimes you'll find grapes that are they're planted so long ago, they're still planted on their own root stocks, and those vines tend to make really special things. But because there is no legal definition, you can use it the same way you use the word reserve in this country. And to use the word reserve, what you have to be able to do is spell the word reserve. And it's kind of the same thing with old vines. So you'll see Bodabox old vines, which makes me cringe a little bit. I would say the generally agreed upon amount of age for a vine would be somewhere in the 40 to 50-year-old range.
Yeah.
To be start calling that a Via Vigna, an old vine, or to use those terms. But understand there is no legal definition for what old vines really mean. So, know your producers again as best you can.
Yeah. Yep. All right.
We have one more producer.
One more.
And a truly, truly great producer, making, I think, the most iconic Zinfandel in Napa. And this is Bob Biale from the Biale Winery. And we're drinking the new vintage of Black Chicken. This is the 2017 vintage, which is kind of iconic. I always love this wine. It's always a little bigger and a little darker and just a little more hedonistic.
Well, you can tell just looking at the color compared to the first two wines we tried. The Marietta and the Bedrock. Just looking at it in the glass over the white paper, it is a darker, more intense, plum color than the first two.
Pat is so studious. He's examining the color. I'm like, that's good. I want to drink that. He's paying attention to the robe. And he's good man. I'm just digging the wine, and I love the story behind this wine. So it's kind of an interesting tale. Shortly after Prohibition, a gentleman who was an Italian immigrant named Pietro Biale decided that he was going to plant some Zinfandel in his farm. And that was kind of a crazy thing. That between the Great Depression and Prohibition, there wasn't really any demand in California for grapes. So this was kind of a bold thing to do. But he really believed in Zinfandel and the California wine industry, and so he planted this. And his farm had chickens and walnuts and fruit and other kinds of fruit. But it was not enough to be sustainable for him. So he worked a second job, which was in a quarry. And sadly, in 1942, there was an explosion at the quarry, and it killed Pietro Biale and left behind his wife, his widow, and their 13-year-old son, Aldo. And Aldo's mom, Pietro's wife, never remarried, and so it really fell on him to help support the winery. Now, his uncle knew how to make wine, and you weren't really supposed to be doing that during Prohibition, but all bets were off afterwards. Right. But it was still very, very heavily regulated. It still is. Pat and I couldn't just start producing wine without getting permits and registering things with the government and paying taxes, all these things you have to do with a controlled substance. Well, Aldo didn't really know how to do that and didn't want to do that. They needed all the money. So he basically started making some hooch, and they would hide this in their basement. And back in the day, if you called, let's say one of us wanted to call and order a white leghorn chicken, which they were famous for, and a dozen eggs and some walnuts, but we wanted a bottle of Zin, we would have to also say we'd like a gallina nera, a black chicken, because at the time the phones, there were party lines, so your neighbors could listen in.
Oh, that's right.
There were different rings. You were supposed to wait for your ring, but you didn't have to. You could pick up the phone and listen in on somebody else's call. So this was Aldo's code word that where I need a black chicken was I need a jug of your Zinfandel. So I love this story.
Cool. That's a great story.
But the wine is every bit as great as the story. This is a vineyard that Aldo and Nana, his mom, they've worked this for their entire lives, basically. And then there's a little bit of fruit from a neighboring vineyard that they also own in the Oak Knoll district. And this is a little cooler part of Napa, so you don't end up with wines that, again, are big and overblown. There's some alcohol to this wine. It is domestic Zinfandel, but again, it's always balanced. But it is that darker style, that just kind of real lush, just yummy. Yummy, I think, is a descriptor that we can use today.
Yes, that is yummy. It is good. It's very supple. It's lush. It is big, but doesn't come across as a big smack you across the head. Zinfandel.
Right.
But there is much more going on in this wine than the previous two.
I'd almost call that a Cabernet drinker's Zin. It does have that darker fruit and a little more structure to that.
Yep.
And it's going to go great just with a steak with protein. And I'll put prices up on the video just so you can see these. But we're usually about $14 on the Marietta Old Vine Red. Usually about $28.99 on the Bedrock Old Vine Zin, and then we end up about mid-30s, I think, on the Biale, depending on whether these are on sale or not. And Pat's been great. You've been great about putting some of these really wonderful things on the videos on sale. So I hope that people are enjoying what they're hearing about on the videos and enjoying them when they try the wines and appreciating the prices as well.
Yeah, I think so.
Thank you, Pat.
Oh, you're welcome, and thank you guys for joining us. Zinfandel, we look forward to bringing you another video, hopefully very soon. And cheers.
Cheers. We'll see you soon. Thank you.